Okay. All right. So we're continuing along in this halacha. What we saw last week is that there is a mitzvah to go lifnim mishuras hadin, above and beyond the letter of the law, and to forgive a worker who not only did he not fulfill his job of transporting an object from point A to point B, but he also broke the object in the process. And that's where we started talking about moving companies and things like that last week. Okay, and we pointed out that there's a machlokas actually in the Rishonim as to whether or not a person should feel compelled that he's got to forgive. He says, Ein shum, according to another cohort of Rishonim, Ein shum chasidus limchol lesavel sheshiber bipshia. He says, according to other Rishonim, there is no reason, even from a midas chasidus, and even from a point of piety, to forgive someone who broke something out of negligence. So it all depends on the place and on the context that a person does have this latitude to either be more merciful or less merciful, but it's certainly the position of the Rav Shulchan Aruch that being merciful and going above the letter of the law is called upon in this situation. So we had seen the Imrei Yaakov, and we'll take a look at this next biur, Lifnim Mishuras Hadin, Shenemar Laman Telech. He says there was a pasuk from Mishlei quoted that it was based on the Gemara. Not only did Rav say, should you not charge them for the broken item, but because they're poor, you should also pay them so that they have something to eat at the end of the day. And as the Imrei Yaakov pointed out, is that not charging them is one level of piety, but then proactively paying them for a job that they never performed is even an additional level of piety that you'd only really feel compelled to do if these guys literally don't have a meal to eat at the end of the day. Okay, so the Imrei Yaakov over here says the biurim, he says, Da dolasos lifnim mishuras hadin yalfinan min hakra. We learn that a person should go above the letter of the law based on a totally different pasuk that's being quoted here in Mishlei. It says, Kedisa b'gemara mehadich siva hodatalahem es haderech b'chulei asher ya'ason. He says, and we quoted this pasuk when we learned it in the Imrei Yaakov, that there's Yisro tells Moshe, you will instruct the Jews the pathway that they shall do. In other words, when something is too difficult, you have a right to instruct the people. When something's too difficult for the lesser judges, and we learn from that pasuk, show people the right path is not just doing mitzvahs, but it's going above and beyond the requirement of the mitzvah to choose the proper path in life. Aval kasvu atosvus the ma'iseh sheshibru hasabolim esachavis v'asulu hefsid gadol gam mishum lifnim mishuras hadin ein lo lahafsid. But Tosfos in the Gemara that we learned last week comments that the reason why the Gemara doesn't quote that pasuk from the Chumash is because this is beyond the letter of the law. There's beyond the letter of the law, and then there's beyond the letter of the law. In other words, this even based on the requirement to go above the requirement, this even is beyond that. It's just out of an act of mercy. He says, and that's why we bring the pasuk from Mishlei. He says, and we should note further that when we say that it's proper to forgive the worker for breaking your object, that's only for a worker who was working for you. But if a guy breaks your property, like they're playing ball in the street and someone throws the baseball and it crashes through your window, okay, there is no indication whatsoever. Or like I gave you the example of my neighbor backing his car into my car. He says there is no mitzvah to be even going beyond the letter of the law, to be forgiving. V'lo rak ba'ofen zeh shekasav kan harav shehahezek ba'al yedei ritza b'pshia. And that's not only true when the damage was done out of an act of negligence because someone was running too quickly. Ela afilu baha dekaimelon b'simin shinayin chesif beis dim nofel mehagag behizik bein baruch mitzuya bein baruch she'ina mitzuya the chayiv l'shalim. He says, but there's a halacha that's based on the Gemara that if a person falls off the roof and ends up crashing on the ground and breaking a bunch of kalim, a bunch of utensils, it doesn't. Even if he took the proper precautions, and it's just a very uncommon gust of wind that blew him off the roof, made him lose his balance, he still has to pay for whatever he broke. Now, and arguably in those kinds of scenarios, there's no pshia, there's no negligence whatsoever. But nonetheless, we say there's a principle in the Gemara, Adam mu'ad le'olam, which means that people are assumed, or people are damagers, have a position of being damagers at all times. In other words, when it comes to human beings, you can't. There's really no way for us to properly protect ourselves from other human error, and so human beings are prone to damage, and therefore, whenever they do damage, they have to pay full damages. But when it comes to an animal, normally you have to wait until the animal gores 3 times before it becomes a damaging animal. But but throughout that discussion in the Gemara about human error and human damage, we never find anyone suggesting that there's a mitzvah to forgive someone who causes damage. V'hatam nira, the dafka b'pol sha'asak ba'avoda l'tovas ha'ba'olim b'zeh yesh mitzvah l'mcholo. So Rav Stern says, so then why is it over here that there is a mitzvah to forgive a worker? He says, and here we're talking about where the guy was negligent. So he says, it seems to me that it's because the worker is extending himself to help the balabayit, because I'm doing you the kindness or the favor of extending you work. Then there's becomes a reciprocal sort of ethical obligation that an employer has to an employee to try and be more forbearing when the employee makes an error than with a stranger, despite the fact that he's being paid. It's almost an implicit part of the work contract that not only will I pay you an hourly wage or for the job that you're doing, but I will also be forbearing because you're working for me. There's a greater sense of kinship between the two of us, and I have to take that into consideration when you do break something of mine.
Such a vast employee relationships.
Yeah, right.
The longest time.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Victorian England, right?
Exactly, down in the mines.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Hagam sharitzas hapoya lo haya l'tovas habaolim. He says, so therefore, even though when the guy was running, he wasn't doing it for the sake of his boss. He was doing it so that he could get home early from work that day. As he said, that's what he says explicitly. But because the fellow is dedicating himself to his employer, there becomes an ethical issue of trying to be more forbearing with him. Inami, alternatively, you could look at it this way. Shiny poel, shematzinu, shehiknu, bo devarim litovasa, uchamoshikasaf harambam v'zelashana. There's another way of looking at it is that we find that employers have an ethical obligation to extend certain things to an employee. She'imata omer yishalem ein lecha adam she'yavir chavis lachavera. And it's really because of a social contract to encourage people to be part of a working class. He says, as the Rambam writes in Hilchos Chirus, if you're going to always obligate an employee to pay for breakage, it's going to be harder to find workers who are prepared to work with fragile items, Lefichach asu shviras achavis kemisas habehemo shviras ad kan loshana. And therefore, the rabbis sort of assigned a certain artificial designation. They said that when you break utensils, you should treat it like the animal died, and it's no fault of the employee, even when the employee is negligent. But when it comes, in other words, if the whole objective is to create a greater social dynamic that people will want to work to hire themselves out to transport fragile items, then we can understand that it's only for workers that there's this aspect, there's this mitzvah to be forbearing and forgiving. Well, it could be that that's part of it, but let's say the guy's a mover and it's a one-time job. You'll never see him again, right? So that's why this reason, I guess, he uses from the Rambam.
Someone is involved with food, you have to feed them, or you have to allow them to eat food if they're taking crops.
That's right. That's what we had seen just recently. Yeah, you're not allowed to muzzle. You're not allowed to muzzle even an animal when they're working out in the field. Yeah, there's a certain compassion. V'lo od ela afilu b'shomer she'osek b'shmira mikol makam hol ve'eno matriach atzmo ba'avoda so ein tzarich limchalo. He says, but I'll go even further in creating these distinctions. It's only for employees who are proactively working in the transport of fragile goods that there's a mitzvah to forgive them when something breaks. But let's say someone is just acting as a watchman, a guard, and through their negligence, items get stolen or get eaten by an animal or something like that. There too, there's no mitzvah to be forgiving with the shomer. And why is that? Because he's not proactively schlepping your item. It's only when a person is really exerting himself proactively and burning calories to help make sure that you get your items, that you have to be forgiving when he drops something accidentally. The dafka saval, the efshar gam b'shliach b'schar, shehu michiyato v'torach ba, aval shomer socher shapasha ach midas chasidus ein kan afilu hu ani. And the Sefer Pischei Choshen says the same thing, that there is no even aspect of piety to forgive someone who's just passively guarding something and then falls asleep. And then through his negligence, the item gets stolen or damaged. And then he concludes in the parentheses and he says, I refer you to the Rambam who writes that if a woman breaks her husband's property, when she's doing regular housework, and the guy comes home and he sees that his favorite bowling trophy is cracked in half because she was dusting the mantelpiece, right? The Petura Mishum, does anyone go bowling in Toronto? The Petura Mishum Shalom Bias, that the Rambam writes that a wife is always exempt from financial liability to her husband because of Shalom Bias. Now, obviously, if she gets into a real tirade and she deliberately breaks things, that's a totally different issue. That's right. Well, yeah, that's even worse. Yeah. You can't even joke about those things because they go on, unfortunately. Yeah. Okay. So we have a little bit more of a sort of a limit placed on when you are not obligated to go above and beyond the letter of the law. Number one, we saw that it's beyond the letter of the law. So therefore, there's certainly, and we also saw there's a whole cohort of Rishonim who are more limiting of this aspect of piety. And many of them say that no, when it's totally the worker's negligence, you're not obligated to be forgiving. It's only when it's a group of workers where you can't assign blame to any one particular worker. If you remember, we saw that last week. So there's some gray here, right? Some gray. When do I have to be forgiving? When do I not have to be forgiving? If we take a look at the Likutim over here, Laman telech b'derech tovim v'orchos tzadikim tishma. The pasuk in Mishlei is so that you shall walk in the path of the good, and the pathways of the righteous you shall uphold. Agra b'Mishlei sham kasav ezelashana. So the Vilna Gaon has a very important commentary to the book of Mishlei. I remember studying at least a part of Mishlei when I was in Yeshiva Bacher. He says, Tov hu nikra hametiv im habrios. He says, good is he who is called, who does good with others. In other words, you're called Tov, you're called a good man when you deal with others properly. B'tzadik hu ha'oset tzedakos v'nosin mishalo labrios b'china. And when are you called a tzaddik? When you actually give of your possessions. That you're not just nice, but you actually give away your property to others. So that's why there's a bifurcation in this pasuk. The first part, Laman telech b'derech tovim, go in the path of the good, is when you forgive the guy and don't make the employee pay. But what the latter part, which talks about the pathways of the righteous, why are you called righteous? Because not only are you not requiring him to pay, you're being nice, but you're actually taking out of pocket to make sure that he has what to eat at the end of the day. Avshalo hayaroi, even if the person didn't deserve it. Va'afla lahitivi mahem v'hu osa otzadaki mahem zeu anikra tzadik hu yoter bil hatovim. And so when you do good and you do that act of tzedakah afterwards, you're called a tzaddik, even more so than just tov. Lachein otam heim mu'atim. And that's why this is a much rarer commodity to be found. Kizeh yoter kashe al ha'adam lasos gam tzedakah im habrias. Because it's harder for a person to do what the latter part, the tzedakah part, than it is to be nice. Aval lehetiv labrios tahainu shelo lasos ra zed darko shel rov bnei adam. To not be malicious, to not be vengeful, right, and to be nice in general to people, that's normal human behavior. Alavai, right? That's what that. But he says, but that's normative. Af lamisha hayaroi lasos ra lefi hadin. And people tend to be nice even when other people deserve to be scorned and treated badly. Lachein ksiv eitzel hatovim derech shehu derech rachav. And that's also why the pasuk uses orchot versus derech. Laman telech b'derech tovim, v'orchos tzadikim tishmor. What's the difference between a derech and an orach? A derech is a wide pathway. It's a wide road. And an orach is a narrow road. So a derech is something that more people traverse. It's more common for people to be nice than it is for people to be righteous. Aval eitzel hatzadikim orchot, v'gam amar tishmor lefi she'ein darkan shel rov bnei adam lasos, lachein zu tzarich shmir. And also it says preserve the pathways of the righteous, because since most people are not righteous in that sense, it needs to be protected. And then the Vilna Gaon says, based on this, we can understand how the Gemara uses that pasuk. And so after he quotes the Gemara, the Vilna Gaon says, "V'lichora eno muvan, shemitchila amarlei v'laman telech b'derech tovim, ve'etzel aschar amarlei v'orchos tzadikim tishma." Why did you need to use both halves of the pasuk? The first half referring to being nice and not charging them, and then the second part being a tzaddik and even giving them out of pocket. He says, but it makes sense now, because based on what we've explained, we understand that to forgive the damage is to be tov, is to be nice, right? Aval litain lahem od mishalo eno afilu derech hatovim l'chein amar shezehu ve'orchos tzadikim laseis lahem mishalo shein yischai v'litain lahem adin. Right, as we explained, it's a narrower path. It's less expected of people to go even out of pocket to give money to people who don't really deserve it. Umasha kasav dina hachi amar le'in klomar negdecha din kain shezehu archa sadikim ad kama shana. And therefore, when Rabbi Bar Chana came to Rav and said, "But Rebbe, is that the halacha?" Rav said to him, "Yes, it is the halacha." Meaning what? Not that you're obligated to, but a person of your caliber, a person of your level of righteousness, you should be doing this. And this is a general principle that Hashem is more HaKadosh Baruch Hu medakdek im chasidav kichut hasara. What does that mean? God is more demanding of the righteous and the pious than he is from the normal person. Yeah, reliance on you find that in a number of instances theologically you find it, but also what you see is that it works in ethics as well. You don't want to be the guy in the room who has to rely on the halachic obligation when everyone else detects that you got to be a nice guy. You understand what I'm saying? In other words, what Rav was essentially paskening for Rabbi Bar Chana is, yes, according to the letter of the law, you would not be obligated to pay them, and you could even charge them for the breakage. But you're a tzaddik, and a tzaddik doesn't do that. And as such, you have an obligation to live up to your reputation as a tzaddik. And that's why another example is the Gemara says that any Talmid Chacham who has a stain on his garment is liable for the death penalty. Now, of course, having a stain on your garment is not the commission of a crime, right? But what our Chazal are teaching us is that when you represent the Torah, you have a higher calling. You have a greater level of obligation. So here what we're seeing is, based on the Vilna Gaon's commentary, is that this would especially be true when there are onlookers, when there are people who can learn a moral lesson from your behavior. So you're the boss of a company, or there are, you can make a Kiddush Hashem in another scenario with the movers, or however you want it, because they're familiar with Orthodox Jews. So this would only add to the virtue in being forgiving. But you have to weigh it again. If these people are exploiting your kindness, then sometimes there's not a mitzvah to be forbearing and forgiving. Okay? So.
I may have asked this question last week, and I'm not sure how I ended up that I may have answered it. But would this come out of the Meister money, the second, or we keep using slightly righteousness?
It seems like this is an act of tzedakah. So to forgive them for the breakage, there's no out of pocket, so you can't use that as your Meister money, even though arguably, right, by not charging them, you've lost. What if they break a Fabergé egg of yours, right? How much does a Fabergé egg cost? I don't know. It's thousands upon thousands, right? And so your net value has gone down 10%. You could argue, well, let me take it out of my Meister money. I'm not sure. It's actually a legitimate shaila. But certainly, when you're paying them from your own pocket, that is definitely considered tzedakah. It's no different from giving a poor person tzedakah, a total stranger. So if it ends up costing you a couple of grand, you can deduct that from what you would normally give out to tzedakah.
The hierarchy we talk about, in some ways, Israel employees are kind of like the family. That's maybe they get it before other people in the city or people in another country or whatever, because it's part of the family of the not as close as your own family, but maybe there's a linkage. Don't think so? You have an ongoing relationship with them.
Right. So if it's an ongoing relationship, maybe. But
Yeah,
again, like the you made that argument previously, and I said we haven't seen that distinction brought down in the poskim, but it could be. You're right. We don't have an indication from anything that we've seen written over here. Could be a Rabbeinu Parrot somewhere. Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's go on to the next halacha, unless you want to discuss this further. Everyone satisfied with this? Okay, so let's go. So, after we've talked about how employers have an ethical obligation. So we've talked about the halachic obligation to pay them in a timely fashion. We've talked about the ethical obligation to be forgiving with them, even when they fail to do the job that you hired them for. So now let's talk about the ethical obligations of an employee, okay? Because we've really focused on the employer right up until now. Ron's ears just got bigger. Yeah. So, he says the employee has an obligation, even an employee who's poor, right, and really needs the money from the job. He has an ethical obligation also not to waste any time in the work that he's doing. Because what happens is a worker can take a coffee break here and a little break there and a little break there and whittle away the entire day and get very little done. And instead, a worker has to be very careful with his time. So that's just all we're gonna see today. I have to just finish a couple minutes early because the mayor of Jerusalem is coming. I want to make sure that everything is set up. So we'll continue Mirza Hashem this halacha tomorrow, okay? All right, have a great day, everyone. Yeah.